Reverend Al Sharpton for allowing that conversation to happen, because we know that media plays an important role in how our narrative is being told. And so that was an amazing conversation. At this time, we will now hear words and remarks from the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, and that is the one and only Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Hello, I'm Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, and it's an honor to be joining you again, even if it's a virtual appearance this time. And I'm already looking forward to when we can next gather together in person. I want to thank you for inviting me to help celebrate this 30th anniversary and share some thoughts on the occasion. For 30 years, the National Action Network has moved this country toward justice, equality, and equal rights for all. The arc of American life does not bend toward justice on its own, not without the hands and the efforts of moral leaders like you. And thank you to Reverend Sharpton for being such a leader, a powerful voice helping America to constantly be better and do better, someone from whom I have learned a great deal. Ours is a complicated moment, one in which the scale of our challenge is matched only by the scope of our opportunity. We are still struggling to wrestle with the national tragedy of a pandemic, with disproportionate rates of infection and death in communities of color. But we finally have hope, with millions of Americans being vaccinated each day, and a White House that has made vaccine equity a pillar of the response. In our economy, people are still teetering on a high wire, and many are paying more for transportation and housing each month than their paycheck can sustain. But we stand here with an opportunity to make the largest investment in American jobs since World War II. We need to overcome 4 years of damage and 400 years of injustice, a mountain of mistrust built over the centuries and still growing today, with yet another painful reminder of America's racialized inheritance in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. But we also have Washington poised to pass game-changing progressive policies, policies that organizations like the National Action Network have been championing for years. And we have the first black woman vice president in history, along with the most diverse administration team yet to serve this country. We live with all of these different and challenging truths all at once in this moment. We meet this moment with grounds for hope, the hope inspired by vaccines, new jobs, and an administration dedicated to equity. And that is a testimony to the impact of hard work and organizing, the value of groups like the National Action Network, and the power of advocacy as well as direct service. Especially in this moment, black and brown communities and activists across the country have demanded more of America, insisting that this country do better not only by all of those who have been excluded or oppressed, but by this country's own professed creed. The work ahead is daunting, but it is heartening that on the national stage today, we're discussing how much progress we can make, how big we can go, and no longer just how much damage we must deal with. You now have partners in Washington who believe that equity is not a program, it's not a department, it's a profound value and a lens that must apply to every program, every department, and every decision. We know that racism is responsible for more destruction and injustice than any other force in American life. So I'm proud to be part of the Biden-Harris administration where anti-racism is policy. And I'm glad that you're hearing from many of my fellow cabinet members this week about the good work that we're doing together. The Biden-Harris administration made clear that racial equity and support for underserved communities would be an all-of-government, all-of-society priority. It was encoded from day one in the President's order and embodied in the Justice 40 initiative that has the goal of delivering 40% of the benefits of the President's investments to historically underserved and overburdened communities. So let's talk about the work we need to do to get there. Transportation is a foundation of our economy, and it's also an expression of our values. Advancing racial equity is among my highest priorities as Secretary. The transportation decisions we make can either exacerbate inequity or build a better future. And we're clear on the path that this department will take. We are working to ensure that equity is central to how we spend taxpayer money. In this administration's earliest days, we announced that we were adding racial equity as a consideration for transportation projects in the $889 million Infrastructure for Rebuilding America, or INFRA, program. This month, we revised the $1 billion BUILD program, which provides competitive grants for transportation projects, and renamed it the Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, or RAISE program, to reflect that new emphasis in our evaluation criteria. We're also looking at how DOT can help address inequities in our criminal justice system, so that a traffic stop is no less safe for a black person than it is for a white American, and how we can support voting initiatives as the sacred right to vote comes under attack in states across the country. We've created an equity task force for this department, one in which I will be involved personally, to make sure that this remains a North Star to guide our work throughout this department and throughout this administration. These are important steps that will benefit communities, but they're steps. We need a giant leap, which brings me to the American Jobs Plan. This could be the best chance in our lifetimes to transform our infrastructure, and with it, the foundation that allows every American to live, work, and thrive. It will provide more than a $2.25 trillion investment in American infrastructure, including $621 billion for transportation and resilience. It will do so many good things, and I want to touch on just a few highlights. The American Jobs Plan will help create millions more jobs in cities and towns and communities across the country. Good jobs, often union jobs, the majority of which will go to people without a college degree, building a modern infrastructure. The plan also invests $100 billion in workforce development programs focused on underserved communities. The plan includes $20 billion for road safety. That's important for everyone, but it's certainly a matter of equity. On our roads, the fatality rate of black people is twice that of white people. We cannot accept this. The plan includes $80 billion to expand and modernize Amtrak and the rail network, and it doubles federal funding for public transit. Again, that's important for everyone. It is certainly a matter of equity. Black people are 4 times more likely than white people to rely on public transit to commute to work. And they deserve a commute that is reliable, safe, and affordable. This is especially important because in 2019, our lowest income households spent 37% of their after-tax income on transportation. That's up from 29% just 2 years earlier. We can't accept this. The plan also includes $174 billion to help spark the electric vehicle revolution. We will rebuild our infrastructure in a way that is not only more resilient, but actually helps fight climate change. And 40% of the benefits of those climate and clean infrastructure investments will be targeted to historically underserved and overburdened communities. Now is finally the time to address these major inequities, including those caused by highways that were built through black and brown communities, as well as decades of disinvestment that left small towns and rural main streets stranded. The President's American Jobs Plan includes $20 billion to reconnect neighborhoods cut off by past transportation decisions, to advance opportunity, equity, and environmental justice in new transportation projects. I've just mentioned a lot of numbers, but I want to put them all in context. We have not, since President Eisenhower, made such an investment in infrastructure, and we have never in our history made such an investment in transportation equity. My predecessor in the Obama-Biden administration, Secretary Anthony Foxx, did especially important work to advance the cause of transportation equity. I know that I have big shoes to fill in this regard, and I'm thrilled that we may have the resources, thanks to this bill, to further deliver on a vision that Secretary Foxx helped introduce. What we see throughout all of these investments is a lesson that goes beyond transportation, that equity is good for everyone. The American Jobs Plan will not solve every problem in every community, but it will address many of the challenges we face today and create a stronger, more equitable future for decades to come. It empowers our young people to inherit and build a country where the American dream is truly, finally accessible to all. And that's what your work has been all about. The National Action Network and other civil rights organizations and community networks have planted the seeds for years. Now it's time for us to water them together. What we grow must be strong enough and vast enough to outlast us all, and I believe it will be. So thank you to the National Action Network, to Reverend Sharpton, to all of you for 30 years of working to make America the best version of herself, a version that lives up to our ideals. Congratulations again on this milestone. Thank you for your good work, and be well.
Let's give it up again for Secretary Buttigieg for those remarks. We're excited to introduce our next panel that is about to come up, the next panel for the double standard of justice, moderated by Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition, David Johns, joined along by Alfonso David, the President of the Human Rights Campaign, Imani Rupert Gordon, the Executive Director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and Kiera Johnson, the Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force. Now, we know as we're fighting for this fight for justice, we must be inclusive, and we must do all we can to fight to end racism. But that also includes the fight against homophobia, that includes the fight against bias and stigma that lies within communities as it pertains to the LGBTQ community. And we know that we all must fight together because we understand that none of us are free until we all are free. And that includes fighting for those from all spectrums of life. And that's why I'm super excited to have this conversation for the double standard of justice. And so we're going to turn it over to the screen for the panel, and we hope that you all enjoy it. And sit back, relax, and enjoy this very informative conversation.
Greetings. My name is David Johns, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. I want to begin by thanking Reverend Sharpton, our sister Ebony Riley, and the team at the National Action Network for thinking it important enough to hold space to have a conversation about the double standard of justice. I'm super excited to moderate a conversation with some giants in the field who are working to ensure that all Black people have the opportunity to be free. And I'm just really excited for us to have a conversation. And so we're just gonna jump right into it. I will introduce each of you by name and title only, and then we'll invite you to answer the following question. And it's, how do you come to this work? For people who might not have been following your leadership, I want you to invite them into your world. And then I'd also like for you to complete the following prompt. What's the best part of being young, gifted, Black, and queer, ... So why don't we start with you, Imani Rupert Gordon, who is the Executive Director of NCLR, National Center for Lesbian Rights.
Thank you so much, Dave, for the introduction. And it's lovely to be on a panel with you all. And every time I am, I know that I'm in the right place. So thanks so much, everyone. So how I came to this work, I wanted to be part of creating a socially just society. And when I was young, I thought that meant something through media. I thought that meant creating characters, and when we understood that there are people that are like us but a little bit different, that there'd be that it would be easier to understand difference. And when I grew up, I realized that you don't actually have to do this in this fake sort of life, and like creating a world, that you can do it in the actual world that you're in. And so I originally had gone to school and I was going to become a therapist. And then I just realized that I wanted to be part of creating touching a larger group of folks, looking at larger systems in place as opposed to working with people individually and one-on-one. And so I ended up at the Broadway Youth Center working with LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness. And then I worked at Affinity Community Services serving Black LGBTQ women in Chicago. And now I've been at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And I just love this. I love this work. I love working in coalition with amazing folks. And the second question was, what's the best part of being young, queer, Black, I believe? Honestly, I would say that.
Don't forget gifted, Omani.
And gifted. Honestly, I would say that I would say being loved and appreciated, because I I feel loved and appreciated, and I love young, gifted, Black LGBTQ people. Thanks again for having me.
No, of course, I love that. Thank you for that. Let's pass the mic to our sister, Kara Johnson, who is the Executive Director of the LGBTQ Task Force. Do you want me to repeat the questions, Kara?
I think I got it. How I came to this work, it's so funny. I feel like I answer that question differently anytime I'm asked it. And I think social justice, my family wasn't very political, and yet they had very strong values, right? That weren't like dictated, right? Or necessarily, we want you to grow up and be ... right? But they modeled it and they reflected, what it meant to be compassionate and what it meant to be in community and what it meant to be non-judgmental and what, why it's important to be a critical thinker. So there were all of these foundational things throughout, my younger life. I think that they kind of set me on a path to do this work. I mean, I knew early that I wanted to be of the people. I mean, in a different way. I was convinced I was going to be a lawyer. I was like, I'm going to be a lawyer, and I'm going to be a lawyer for brown people and immigrants and women and poor people. I knew it. I can see myself at 16 years old. Remember when you were 16, you wore like your first like suit jacket? Like I was like, oh yeah, like this is what I'm supposed to do. And then real life set in different ways. And actually my sister got pregnant, told me she was pregnant when she was 16. And I knew that my life was going to take a different turn. I wasn't going to be in law, but I wanted to be an activist. I wanted to be an advocate. I wanted to be an organizer. And so my first, paid position in this work was as the Maxine Waters Reproductive Freedom Fellow at what was then called Choice USA, is now Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity. And then it was a very short road to the LGBTQ movement, right? It was really clear to me at 19 years old that women's rights and reproductive justice and LGBTQ liberation were built from the same soil, right? Our quest for bodily autonomy, self-determination, agency, the right to love who we love and build the families that make sense for us, right? Like it's like we were just two different trees, like in the same soil. I found myself volunteering and doing cross-movement organizing. And I got a position at the task force about 3 years ago as the deputy executive director and have become the ED since then, about 2 months ago. And I'm exactly where I want to be. It's like every day I know that my work, my life and my work coalesce in such beautiful, like impactful, meaningful ways that bring me joy, challenges too, but definitely more joy, which is why I'm still here. So I'm in it to win it. And what's the best part of being young, gifted, Black, and queer? I have to say, especially now, it's like I've got a whole bunch, like I've got a community of those folks, right? Like as a young person, right, I felt really weird, right? Like I was like a super weirdo. Like I was like, I don't know if Black kid that listens to like Guns N' Roses, right? And then I'm like the only Black kid doing political organizing, and I'm also queer, but none of my Black friends are talking about being queer. Like, oh my God, I'd rather read in a book than go to the club. Most times, not all the time. The artsy kid. I was a speech and debate kid, right? Like I love to have fun. I love to joke. I love to party, and I'm super cerebral and like just weird. And now I found a whole community of like Black, gifted, queer weirdos. Like there's a whole bunch of us, right? Like doing community work and doing advocacy work. And I guess now as a less young, I'll stay with young-ish. It feels really good to be occupying space and positions and power and airwaves in a way that I know other young, queer, gifted Black people have access, right, to me. And I didn't have that, right, when I was 12, 13, 15, 16. And we get to be that for a whole new generation, and that feels really good.
Yeah, we're happy you're in it because we like to win and enjoy watching you in this new role. Last but certainly not least, my brother Alfonso David is the president of the Human Rights Campaign. How did you enter the work, brother, and how do you complete the prompt? What's the best part of being young, gifted, Black, and queer?
Oh, I just want to say Kiara's answer just gave me so much life. So thank you for that. How did I come to this work? Like Kiara, I think I answer this question differently every time I'm asked this question, but it's all grounded in one seminal moment in my life where I went through a civil war in Liberia. I lived a very privileged life. My parents were in politics, and my father was arrested and my uncle was killed. And we were living under house arrest for several years. And the idea of becoming a surgeon and focusing on medicine evaporated very quickly as I confronted, what does democracy mean? And what does freedom mean? As a 10-year-old kid, when you lose your freedom, and you really lose your freedom, you start having those difficult conversations very early on when you may not even have the tools to really adequately evaluate what you're asking yourself. So for me, I knew at a very young age that I wanted to fight for the oppressed, and I wanted to fight for marginalized people. And that passion became even stronger as I went through middle school and then high school, moving to the United States, being ostracized for being, quote, African, folks looking for my tail. I appreciated at a very young age that the law has been used for such a long time to oppress people. And those who master the law are in the best positions possible to actually manipulate it so that it can actually benefit those who need it the most. And so I ended up going to law school, ended up clerking for a federal judge, working in the private sector for a number of years, running 2 different companies, and then finally went into the not-for-profit world and civil rights generally. And that was about 20 plus years ago. And the goal there for me was to really think about how I can use my skills to benefit those who are most marginalized. So I joined an organization called Lambda Legal, which is a civil rights organization. I litigated cases all around the country, everything from HIV discrimination cases to education cases to the marriage case in New York. And then I entered into government, and I spent 12 years in government. And that shift for me was important because I had spent 3 years in a not-for-profit world fighting for justice and equality, only to lose when we went up to the Court of Appeals in New York, and the court said, well, there is no fundamental right to marry the person of your choice, and certainly not for same-sex couples. So I went into government and worked at the Attorney General's office and then worked at the governor's office and had the privilege of working on a variety of pieces of legislation and policy, from the marriage equality law in New York to drafting regulations to protect transgender people. And that was such a rewarding experience. I did not think I would come back to the not-for-profit space, but HRC called, and the offer was too good to deny, because at the moment that I considered it, we were in the midst of the Trump administration. And LGBTQ people were under assault. We still are, but we certainly were from the White House. And I took the job in part because I see that we have an opportunity to transform the landscape in our lives, that we have an opportunity to leave this place much better than we found it for LGBTQ people. And I believe that taking this role at the Human Rights Campaign allows me to play a part in advancing this trajectory for our community writ large. For me, the best part of being young, I'm not sure how much young I am anymore, but young, gifted, Black, and queer, is being able to see that vision of the future that I know is going to change, but being able to see it now. Being able to appreciate the resilience and the beauty of our community, a community that has been oppressed for so long, and every single time we rise, seeing how we've breaking down silos, see how we break down stereotypes in our own communities, is, for me, one of the best parts of being young, gifted, Black, and queer, and seeing young leaders that are not saddled with some of the struggles that we were saddled with when we were young people. And for me, that's just beautiful.
It was important for me to ask you how you come to the work, because it is clear to me that there's still a whole lot of work for us to do within our community to remind folks that as long as there have been Black people, we have been beautifully and incredibly diverse. When you think about the challenges that exist as well as the opportunities that exist, in particular at this moment in this movement for Black lives, and when you think about the leadership, the responsibilities that come with the leadership and the spaces that you occupy, what are the most important conversations that Black folks should be having? What are the most important actions that we should be taking so that each of us have and know the freedom that Brother Alfonso talked about now? Alfonso, why don't you start?
I think the most important conversation that we need to have is twofold. One is about our humanity, and the second is about equity. When I say our humanity, is LGBTQ people have been stripped of our dignity for so long. We've seen it, we've seen hate indoctrinated into statutes. We've seen policies issued that seem to deny that we actually exist. But in our own communities, we've also seen our existence denied. We've seen people that we think are part of our community, our Black community, our brown community, that deny that we actually exist and that we contribute to society in the way that we do, that we're history makers, just like everybody else is. So I think one of the most important pieces of the conversation that we need to have is making sure that people see our humanity and afford us with the dignity that we deserve. The second part of that conversation for me is about equity. And we talk about equality all the time, and equality is important. But as we know, civil rights laws have existed in this country since the 1960s, and yet Black people still face discrimination. So we need to think about how we frame our quest for freedom, liberation through the lens of equity, not only as it relates to people that we're working with, but also people who we're not working with. Because many people don't know how to have this conversation about equity and how we get to that place where we can actually achieve liberation. So we need to have the difficult conversations to get there. I think what we sometimes do is avoid those difficult conversations, those uncomfortable conversations. But I don't believe we actually get to a place that we call liberation without having them. And having them with our aunts, having them with our uncles, and having them with our opponents. We need to have those conversations with everyone so they see us, they see our humanity, and they afford us the dignity that we deserve.
Yeah, I received that. Thank you for that. Kiera, same question to you.
One of the things I find myself talking about a lot, and I feel really passionate about it, is that we've got to figure out how we evolve, right, as individuals and as families and as communities, and allow other people to evolve, right? Hold them accountable while also continuing to hold them in community, right? We've heard this, it's almost become a buzz phrase, right? Cancel culture, right? And I know that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And what I feel passionately about is we all have a lot to learn, right? Like where I am at 44 is very different than where I was at 16, which is very different than where I was at 22. And I hope it's very different than where I'll be at 57, right? And there are things that I felt and I experienced and I, thought. When I look back, I'm like, wow, 18-year-old Kiera, boo-boo, wow. Ooh, wow, I'm glad there wasn't Twitter and glad there weren't smartphones, homie, because wow. And so we do live in an age of smartphones, and we do live in an age that is connected, and we connect fast. We are in an age of Twitter and speaking to each other in sound bites, right? And that's not how evolution happens, right? Like that's not how our quest for freedom is going to happen. It's not going to be talking through Twitter, right? Like in sound bites. It is a part of the path, right? But as Alfonso said, we have to engage in deep conversations and listen and allow ourselves the space to be open and evolve. I think about my uncle, who's in his 50s, who converted to Mormonism. I guess we call him Mormonism. Maybe I should ask him, huh? He's a Mormon. And my mom told me just a couple weeks ago, your uncle saw you talking about trans rights and why it's so important in the Black community. And she was like, here, he was just like, I really learned a lot. I'm so proud of her. I learned so much. And I was like, what? I would never have broached the conversation, right, with him about these issues. It's like, right, like with our families, we're like, okay, I got a double Dutch in and double Dutch out, right? I got a little bit of time with you.
That's not where I thought you were going, Fred. I didn't think that's how that story was going to end, so I'm happy to know that that's where it landed.
Yeah, and so, you avoid the conversations that might, get you in a place where it's going to be too much friction, right? Like, because you just want to enjoy the time and keep the peace. But, my father was 42 years older than me. And when I came out, he didn't talk to me for 3 months. By the time I got married, he was speaking at my wedding in tears, talking about, you changed my mind and you changed my heart. I was like, what? This old Black man is like a new person. And then it went even further. Our relationship was such that he shared with me, and it was hard for him to share with me, about the homophobia that he perpetuated, particularly as a younger person in the military. He was specific. He talked to me about specifics and was in tears and was so embarrassed, you know what I mean? But wanted to share like where he's come. And that's not a story to say we don't hold each other accountable, right? It's not like you're absolved of the impact, right, that you have on people's lives. And people have to have the permission to evolve, right? That's who we are as a people. And I think we have to have that conversation because the threat is real. What is consistent is that we, our access to democracy is being, denied, and access to full agency, autonomy over our bodies is being denied as Black people, as women, as trans folks, as young people. If voting didn't matter, right, they wouldn't be working so hard across these states to carve out reasons why certain people can't vote. If it didn't matter, why would someone then prevent you from doing it, right? And same around the Equality Act. I think people are like, oh well, is this really like a cutting edge issue? Like, why should I care? And I'm like, if it wasn't the expansive, visionary piece of legislation that we know it is, it would have already been passed, right? We know that it hasn't passed because it's folks who look just like us who benefit from the Equality Act and the expansion of civil rights, right? It's women who will benefit from the expansion of civil rights. It's trans folks, right, who will benefit from the Right, expansion of civil rights. There's a reason it hasn't passed. There's a reason there is a campaign to prevent it from happening, and that's a red flag. If someone's trying to, do this, you got to get your elbows out, and it means we need to be there. So evolution.
We're about to go there next. We're about to go there next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna stop. I'm on the pull. On the
No, just
on the
don't
dais.
stop. Just
Okay.
pause. Just pause. In part because, but I want to honor and appreciate you naming that which doesn't evolve dies. Right? Like literally, that's a part of what we understand based on biology. And I also appreciate you naming the need for us to hold space for one another as each of us evolve. Right? Again, acknowledge that we're incredibly diverse and the things that connects. The work that we do to all of the members of NAN is this desire to ensure that each of us has the ability to do that, to get to those spaces, to have those kinds of conversations, and to lean in and to listen with love. Imani, before we get into a specific conversation about the Equality Act, and we'll step back and catch people up if they're unclear about what the legislation is, what its impacts are, and some of the things that Kiera was just talking about. What's your response to that question? When you think about the leadership of NCLR, what conversations are most important for us to have, and what actions are most important for us as a community of Black folks, to be specific, should be engaged in?
Oh, thanks so much. Honestly, I think the most important conversation is to be about inclusivity and intersectionality. I think we don't get anywhere without that. And we have to be really careful because so often when we are looking at underrepresented communities, there seems to be a desire to take this part of an identity out. And so when we're talking about an LGBTQ community, that we're not also talking about what this is like, what an LGBTQ person's life is like when they're also a woman, when they're also a Black person, when they're also low income, when they also have a disability or live in a rural area. We're not thinking about those things together, and we have to, because Alfonso was talking about getting to liberation, and that's what we're talking about. We want to get to liberation. This is a process. It's slow moving, but in order to get there, we have to make sure we bring all of us. And historically, our movements have not done a good job of bringing all of us. And that means that we have to have very difficult conversations about who is the most underrepresented within an already underrepresented community and lift everyone up. And that this is not oppression Olympics. But what we need to do is when we are, if the most underrepresented is free, is liberated, then all of us will be. And we have to think about it like this. So often we start having these conversations where folks believe that racism doesn't exist in the LGBTQ community. And that is absolutely untrue. We know that I experienced just as much racism within the LGBTQ community as outside of it. I experienced misogyny within the LGBTQ community. And the thing is, this is not how these things work. Racism doesn't work just like, if someone understands because they also have an underrepresented identity, then they're not going to be part of perpetuating another one. That's not how racism works. And we know that that's not how it works. And so, and putting these things on, and then just starting to believe that this is how things work, we know that that's not how any of this works. And so having conversations about how to be inclusive, how to serve the most underrepresented so that Black trans women are being lifted up, so that when we are getting to a place of equity, that everyone actually gets there. It doesn't work for us if it only works for the select few people that experience the most privilege in an underrepresented identity are getting to liberation. That is not what liberation is. And so we need to have these hard conversations, and we need to do our work better.
Yeah, I've heard Reverend Sharpton preach a number of sermons talking about the work required to support the least of these. And that's what came to mind as I listened to you share that, Imani. Let's go back to the topic of how racism works and go right back to where you started, Kiera. I want to name that each of our organizations are part of a new coalition, the Freedom and Equality for All Coalition, that is designed with one goal, is to pass the Equality Act. There are nearly 100 countries, including Angola, who have laws that prevent discrimination based on sexual orientation, while more than half of Americans across the United States live in states that have lack of comprehensive protections based on sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. And so I want us to have a conversation about the Equality Act, what its implications are, and why it is that Black folk, in particular members of the National Action Network who care and who have cared for Black folks for quite some time, why they should prioritize advocating for passage of the Equality Act. Imani and Alfonso, why don't we start with you? And I'm doing that in specific acknowledgement of your executive leadership within the new coalition. I want to say thank you for that as well.
I was on mute. Thank you. So we have, as you said, David, 16 civil rights, LGBTQ, social justice organizations fighting to pass the Equality Act. So I'm going to do this like a true-false question. The Equality Act is comprehensive non-discrimination policy that would protect us from discrimination. And I'm using us specifically to illustrate this point. Does the Equality Act prohibit discrimination against Black people? The answer is yes. The question is, why should you care? If I walked into a department store today, to buy a new shirt or a new pair of jeans, I could face discrimination as a Black person, and I would have no protections under federal law. Public accommodations. If a woman faces discrimination in a place of public accommodation, she is not protected under federal law. If I, as a gay man, try to serve on a jury, I could be kicked off that jury and I would have no recourse under federal law. If I got into an Uber or into a Lyft, I could be thrown out for being LGBTQ and I would have no protections under federal law. So as Black people, we may not appreciate that we don't have the comprehensive protections that we do need. We need these protections under federal law. We do have some of these protections under state law, but they don't protect me. And as we all know, to Imani's point, I can face discrimination as a Black man or as a gay man, and I may not even know the difference. And if someone understands that they can discriminate against me as a gay man and as a Black man, then I am exposed more than I need to be. So as Black people, we need to, hopefully all of us do, but appreciate that this journey, this walk towards justice, includes all of us. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not include all of the places of public accommodation that we needed to include. They included certain places like pools, but they didn't include other places like barbershops. They didn't include retail stores. So the places that we visit today are not covered under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That's why we need to be actively engaged to pass the Equality Act, to protect me as a Black man and to protect me as a gay man.
I think that was just so well said, Alfonso. You know, I will just add that I think that it's confusing because I think many folks believe that we already have these protections that we don't. And Alfonso made a really amazing point, and that is that we're not protected the way that we think that we are in a lot of ways. A lot of us have privilege in different places, and many of us live in states where we have protection, so we don't have to think about this in the same way. But the Equality Act would give these federal protections to people all over this country. This is a very basic issue of access and an issue of fairness. So this is why we have to do this. This is why we have to do this right now. And the other thing is that this is also not a partisan issue. This is not, over 70% of people want to pass, that believe that LGBTQ people deserve fairness, deserve rights, and deserve protections. And most people think that we already have it, and we simply don't. And this is true for Black people, people of color, for women, for LGBTQ folks. There are many ways in this country that we're still treated as second-class citizens and are not protected by the law. And that absolutely has to change. And we have an amazing opportunity to do that right now with the Equality Act. It couldn't be a better time, and it's so incredibly important.
Yeah, of course. And I want to ensure that everyone is aware of the website, passequalityact.com. I want to acknowledge a name that legacy civil rights organizations, including the National Action Network, have publicly endorsed the Equality Act. The Equality Act has been successfully passed out of the House of Representatives in every Congress that it has been introduced in recently, and most recently with the unanimous support of the Congressional Black Caucus. And so we know that the biggest hurdle at present is passage in the Senate. And so before we move on in the conversation, what are the things people can do? What are the actions that we as a community should be taking to ensure that the Equality Act becomes law? You're muted.
Sorry. I would say people should go to the website, passtheequalityact.com, reach out to any of our respective organizations, the Task Force, NCLR, the Human Rights Campaign, National Black Justice Coalition, and volunteer. We're making phone calls. We are sending out mailers. We need to make sure that people understand that this piece of legislation is sitting in the Senate and we need support to pass it. You don't have to necessarily write a check to get involved, although that would be great. We need people to actually get engaged, to pick up the phone and say, I'm willing to help. I've worked a full day, but I'm going to make phone calls at night. Or I'm going to volunteer in some way to help us pass this law. Because if we don't pass this law, we will continue to face discrimination. 2/3 of LGBTQ people experience discrimination today. So it's not some abstract principle. We're facing these challenges now. And so if you want to get involved, go to passtheequalityact.com. We will send you information. We will engage with you. We will help you figure out the infrastructure you need to engage, to volunteer, because we need your help.
Now, do it now. Thank you.
Do it now.
Now. Let's stay in this space. Let's stay in this space a little bit. For those who might have missed it, the year thus far, 2021, has become a record year anti-trans legislation. There have been nearly 100 anti-trans bills introduced in this state legislative session, which far surpasses last year's record-setting number of 79. And in states like Arkansas, there have been 3 anti-trans pieces of legislation introduced within 1 week. And so let's stay in this space. And for people who just haven't been paying attention, what's happening? What are the implications of this legislation? And what should members of the National Action Network doing?
Well, I mean, this is something that's horrible that's happening, and it's mean, it's cruel, and it's horrible for trans young people, but it's also horrible for all of us. These bills make it impossible for parents to support young trans young people. It makes it impossible for physicians and healthcare providers to provide the necessary support for transgender young people, and it keeps transgender young people from playing sports, which just is horrible and cruel. That is it's bad for sports, and it's bad for people. We know, and I think, probably most of us on this panel have had some experience playing sports, and I know that was a really big part of my leadership and understanding how to work with a team, and that was through playing with sports teams, and taking that away from trans folks it's just cruel. It does not hurt cis people, it does not hurt cis women. That is something that we're hearing, and that's not true at all. If that were true, that was something that we would already know about. Like that is not what's happening. That's not even close to what's happening. And this is just everything that's happening in Arkansas, and all these horrible bills that are happening right now. This is the distraction. This is a distraction. There are actual concerns with women playing sports. There are actually concerns about equity, about fairness, about salaries. There are actually like documented concerns, and making up something that is just hurting our young people. Young people deserve better from us. We need to do better, and this is just, I mean, this is absolutely horrible, and we're seeing it all across the country. Please get out and support, call your legislators, but then also for in the times that this is what's happened here, we're also asking you to support mutual aid organizations that are getting money into the hands of trans people so that they're able to get the stockpile the medical by hormones and by some of the things. Honestly, this is just horrible what's happening to folks, and so we're really in a tough spot. But please get out, call your legislators, and let them know that young people deserve better. They deserve better from us. That we're failing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to unpack three things. And yes, let me unpack three things and then I'll pass it to you, Brother Alfonso. And that's once in the state of Arkansas, a piece of legislation was passed that limits the ability for trans youth to access medical care. There's another piece of legislation that literally allows doctors to turn away LGBTQIA folks or people they imagine might be LGBTQIA folk if they deem that they do not have a medical emergency. And there's legislation that specifically limits the ability for trans girls only to play sports, right? It's problematic on so many levels. Something that Imani said that was incredibly important is that these are solutions in search of a problem, right? For as long as there have been athletes, there have been trans athletes, and gender divisions in sports have not destroyed them, right? And so we should be clear about that. And we should also, as Black folk, be really clear that attacks against trans people are but the tip of a spear that will be used to attack us in ways that are consistent with our lived history. So I just want to make clear that for anyone who does not have the benefit of a meaningful, intimate, I didn't say romantic, intimate, possibly romantic if you're lucky, relationship with a trans person, you should understand that you should care for all of these reasons. Brother Alfonso, go for it.
I just wanted to maybe state the obvious. As Black people, we know that stigma leads to violence. We've seen it for 400 years. Trans people have existed for as long as we've existed. It is not new. Anti-discrimination laws have existed in this country since the 1970s to protect LGBTQ people. Why is this all of a sudden a problem today? Let's all remember that today they come after us, tomorrow they come after you. That our quest for liberation is inextricably linked. Last year we had at least 44 transgender and gender nonconforming people killed in the United States, most of them Black and brown. This year, at least 11 transgender and gender nonconforming people have been killed. There is a direct relationship between the stigma that is created and perpetuated by these bills and the violence that we're seeing in our communities. So we need, to Imani's point, everyone's help to push back against these bills. We have more than 100 of these bills just targeting transgender people, more than we ever have in history. Why is that happening now? Ask yourselves. And how do we overcome these obstacles? We can't do that alone. We need folks at NAN. We need our entire community to engage with us.
Kiera, Alfonso said stigma leads to violence. And we know that for far too long, the experiences of Black folks have been mired in trauma and toxic stress. And just yesterday, I believe, the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law issued findings from a study that reported that younger LGBTQ adults experience greater psychological distress and suicidal behavior than older LGBTQ adults. When you think about our beautiful babies who did not ask to be born, and the challenges they face as a result of the work that needs to be done that we've been discussing, what are the ways that Black folks could be interceding and should be intercepting things on behalf of young folks, of our children and youth?
To Alfonso's point, we've experienced, right, you've experienced this in real ways, related to race and also related to gender, right? I can't help but think about, FloJo, right, and the Williams sisters, like, right. We heard the commentators, right, how they would take pot shots at their bodies, right? Questions about if they were masculine, right, and that's why they were so successful. And what these anti-trans laws do, right, is it makes it legal, right, to put our kids in harm's way, right? It makes bullying and ostracizing and discrimination a regular, normalized, appropriate, legal way to engage our young people. And like you said, the data is out there, right? Like LGBTQ kids are more likely to be depressed. They are committing suicide at higher rates. And I have 3 kids, right? And one of my kids is really, grappling with, right, like what pronouns they want to use, right? Who am I, right? Like I feel a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it matters, it matters to be in an affirming space. We all know, right, what happens when we find our people, right? When we find our Black folks, when we find like the sorority that was right for us, when we find the team, that's our team, right? Like, oh my God, I'm horrible at baseball, but I rock soccer, right? And they're your people. But we also know what it means when we don't have that support. We also know what it means when we can't find the resources, when we hear, side conversations and the doctor doesn't want to touch you, or the teacher makes a comment that is about you and your community, and you don't know what to do with that. It breaks my heart. And like Amani said, our kids deserve better. We know what happens when children are treated with dignity and fairness and respect, right? We know what happens, right? They become superstars, right? It is life and death, right? It is the difference between walking through life with confidence and not, right? It's the difference between being, right, the president, the CEO, the ED of it, right, of an organization or a company, or feeling alone and threatened and unloved and unworthy I don't know why. Like, why would that ever be our choice? And the reality is that as Black folks, no matter what other identity, oppressed identity you put with that, we are going to be disproportionately more affected by that discrimination. It's a sad and unfortunate tale, but it is true. So however you feel about queer people, if you love Black people, know that those Black queer people are going to be more likely, right, committing suicide, more likely to be profiled and put in jail, more likely to not find their pathway to thriving and success.
Yeah. When our babies are loved and supported, they shatter records, like Montero Lamont Hill, aka Lil Nas X. They blaze trails like Zaya Wade, right? They show up in the world like each of you. And I want to name and acknowledge and celebrate our sister who leads GLSEN, Melanie Willingham Jaggers. Their organization provides a lot of data to help make real exactly what Kiara just described. I want to remind folks that this is not, again, an exclusive LGBTQ conversation. We clearly don't lead single issue lives. And so everybody should be aware that the suicide rates for Black children and youth, regardless of their sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression at present or in the future, have doubled in the last 2 decades. And so anyone who purports to care about Black folks, in particular our Black babies, should care about their mental health and well-being. And so acknowledging that, Imani, for folks who might have listened to us have this conversation, who might have received the invitation to support the passage of the Equality Act or to push against anti-trans legislation. And for folks who might think like, that's not my lane, I'm gonna, I'll invest, I'll send a donation. How can Black folks create space for Black, queer, trans, non-binary, intersex members of our community? What are the sort of practical, everyday things that people should consider, that members of the National Action Network should consider to chip away at or otherwise eliminate the double standard that exists within our community?
So we have to remember that this has always been true for our communities. We have always been able to bring people in, and not everyone says that about our communities, but we know that that's true, that we bring folks in, that folks feel supported and respected in our communities. And remember that the LGBTQ folks are part of our community. And we need to figure out what we can do so that it makes it possible so folks want to be their authentic selves, to leave space that we don't know everything about someone, and someone might be working through something, especially with young people, that they might be working through something. And if we provide a space where folks know that they can be comfortable, they know that they can be themselves, they know that they can explore and they will be loved and they will support it, then we're all going to be better for that. And then last thing I want to say is that it's important when we're thinking about policy, because I know a lot of us aren't policy people. There was a long time that I wasn't a policy person. But what we have to remember is that policy isn't, it sounds fancy and it sounds like it's difficult, but all it is making something work. If we think about it, we're talking of the things we're talking about, the Equality Act, the things that we're talking about. We also have to know that healthcare as a system is a public policy solution. We have to think about that policy is just a way to get answers to what we're talking about. I am a social worker by training, and I run the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which is a legal organization. Something that I tell our team all the time is that I am a person in our community, and I am a regular smart person. And if I don't understand what we're doing, then we're doing it wrong. And so when the work that we're doing, it's just important that we do litigation, as we do our legislation work, as we do public policy, and as we do public education. And we have to remember that to get to equality, it hasn't only been activists and people in the streets, though that's been important, and it hasn't only been the folks that have been able to change laws and create structural change. That it has always been the work of all of us together. The people that are standing in the streets, they are standing in the streets because often they want structural change, and that change happens in the courts. And that our work is informed by activists. It's informed by people with lived experiences that know that this is what equality looks like, that this is how we get to equity, and that we always have to work in coalition with each other. And so when folks are saying, this isn't my lane, like policy isn't my lane, it doesn't have to be. Maybe your lane is just making it possible for someone to be who they are so that they can go out and they can be one of the people in the streets demanding change, so they can be one of the people in the courts making sure that change happens. There's a role for all of us here. And you don't have to be a policy person to make that happen. You just have to make it possible for someone to come after you.
Kiara, to Imani's point about the opportunity we have to support people in being who they are, you mentioned earlier supporting and loving a young person who is working through the pronouns that feel most comfortable to them. For the regular smart people who don't understand why they might need to respect someone's pronoun, can you say a bit about that and why it's important?
We're evolving as human beings, right? Like talking about, I'm a very different person at 16, or I'm not 16, at 44 than I was at 16. Most of us are very different, have different ways of walking in the world and dreams for who they want to be in the world. And that starts as kids, right? And it is critical. It's critical for young people to have affirmation and support and unconditional love as they're working through, right, the trials and tribulations of youthhood, right? And that includes, right, a gender identity or a gender expression. I remember when my kid was in preschool, and my partner at the time, she was like, "You're gonna let him go to school with his nails painted?" And I was like, "Yeah." And hello. And she was like, "Well, what if he gets made fun of?" I was like, "He's got lesbians as parents. He's Black. He very well may be. And if he comes back and says, 'I don't want to do this anymore,' we're going to say, 'Okay, let's talk about your experience with us,' right? And when he comes back and says, 'Everybody wants to paint their nails like mine,' we're going to be like, 'That's awesome.' And we're going to get on the phone with the parents who are going to call us who have issues with that, right? That's how it's building support, right? It's showing those kids, no matter what they're experimenting with or how they're walking in their truth, the mistakes and the successes, that the love surrounding them doesn't change, right? It is always unwavering as they're walking through that.
Alfonso, what do you say to our babies, to Black young folk who may at some point identify as members of the beautiful LGBTQIA plus community? What's your message to them, acknowledging all of what we've discussed and even things that we haven't contemplated in the time that we've shared together today?
For our young people, I would say, remember to do one thing. Look in the mirror. Look in that mirror and see a friend. There is so much that comes at Black people and LGBTQ people that tell us that we're less than. And you can never forget your capacity. You can never forget your value and your dignity. And all you need to do, if you think that you may not fit into this box that we're calling, the kings, the queens, the princes of the world, look at our history. Look at our history, right? Look at James Baldwin.
Yeah.
Look at our history. Look at Audre Lorde. So for people to suggest that we're less than, and for you to believe it, we understand, because we've all gone through it. But don't forget to look in that mirror and see your dignity and your value, and the promise and the capacity that has yet to be tapped. Walking into a room every single time and being second guessed that you're about to steal something in a retail store, or being asked twice for something that somebody else has only asked once. We all understand that that has an impact on how we function in the world. But don't allow that experience to steal your passion and your power, because our capacity is untapped. And for any young person who thinks that they're less than, I say, look at this group. I say, look at our history and look in the mirror.
We're going to end things right there in terms of the formal discussion. I got 3 rapid fire questions to land this plane. And I'm going to start with you, Sister Kiera. So my one regret in this moment is that we're unable to have this conversation in person, in part because of the other activities planned around the plenary. And so in the spirit of celebrating the Black church, my 3 questions to each of you are: what is your favorite gospel song? What is your favorite scripture? And how can people follow you or otherwise support the work? We'll start with you, Kiera.
Oh my gosh. Dang it. I'm a bad Southern Christian girl. Okay, my favorite gospel, I'm like I used to sing in the dang gospel choir Umoja in school, and I can't even think of, I don't know, but you know what? It's not a church song, but one of the songs that is my favorite, it takes me to church, is Summertime by now I can't, you put me on the spot like that. Summertime. Give me the name.
I don't know, because I think it's Summertime in the LBC, and that's not a church song at all.
No, dude. A change is gonna come.
A change is gonna come.
You know,
That's a
Yes.
good song. But is that what you're talking about?
No,
Change
but-
Gonna Come?
but the name, the
Oh, no,
artist.
keep saying that's a part of the
Oh, Sam
song.
Cooke.
Sam Cooke. Thank you. I was like, we about to end all blackness right now.
They were
Anyway,
about to take your
Sam
car.
Cooke.
You could name a song. Okay.
So I know
Scripture.
Summertime and A Change Gonna Come, like that, and I sing those to my children before they go to sleep regularly. Scripture. Yeah, no, no scripture.
How can people follow
Oh my
you?
God. I feel like my family
How
is
can people
like,
follow you or
know
support the
what?
work?
You can follow me and talk about how bad of a Southern Christian girl I am. I went to Open Bible Christian School and everything, y'all. Recite all the names of the Bible back in the day. Anyway, but you can follow me on Twitter at Kiara DC, the Task Force, at the Task Force on Twitter as well. Our website is thetaskforce.org. Find us on Facebook. I will even welcome you talking about me and giving me really cool scriptures that I can remember for the future.
Kiara Johnson, thank you, Fran. Appreciate your leadership. Imani, same questions to you. Song, scripture, how can people follow and support the work?
I'm not a religious person. So I would say, for song, I remember growing up on Sunday mornings, there's gospel in our house, but what would stand out to me and what family was for me is on Sunday mornings, we would play Stevie Wonder. And so Songs in the Key of Life is probably my favorite album of all time.
That's heaven sent. See, you good.
But I want to keep this honest. And you can find out more about us at nclrights.org. You can find out more about what NCLR is doing. My Twitter is Imani RG, or you can find NCLR on Twitter as well, Instagram, Facebook as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. It was a pleasure to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Imani Rupert Gordon. Fonzo David, last, certainly not least, song, scripture, how can people follow and support?
So my favorite gospel song is All Is Well With My Soul. It's everything to me. It's what we played when my father passed away. But the counter to that for me is Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace, the entire album. It's a live album. It's incredible. And when I need inspiration, I listen to it very loud. So Amazing Grace. In terms of scripture or Bible verses, I grew up in the Baptist church, in the Methodist church. My parents fought all the time. Which church are we going to go to? Depending on who won. My father won most of the times that we went to a Methodist church. But Psalm 23rd, I would say, is the one that I remember. And you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of them at Alphonso David, ALPHONSO David. You can also go to hrc.org and get all of the information we've been talking about. Resources are available for folks who are interested in supporting the work and supporting all of our organizations in the work that we do.
Awesome. I appreciate you. In case you missed it, my name is David Johns, and I have the pleasure of quarterbacking the team at the National Black Justice Coalition. Especially thankful for the leadership of Reverend Sharpton, Ebony Riley, and the team at NAN for trusting me to moderate this conversation. The song that I hold on to is Daryl Coley's Holy is the Lamb. And I also spend a lot of time now playing Tamala Mann's Take Me to the King. She just sings anything she sings. And I should have, I was thinking about the scripture, but a sermon I keep going back to is Dr. King's But If Not sermon. I've listened to him give it at least 4 times in the last month. And I encourage everybody to support and find out more about our work at NBJC on the Move across platforms. And if nothing else, my hope is that you will all find a way to call your senator and ensure that they pass the Equality Act. That is one critically important step that we can all take to ensure that every member of our community, we're talking about Black folks, folks who look like us, who come from the communities that have conspired for each of our successes, so that each of us can be free now. Thank you for tuning in. We look forward to finding ways to get into good trouble with each of you.
Let's give it up again for our double standard of justice panel. At the end of that, it makes you want to go to church. Let the church say amen. He said, it is well with my soul. I felt that one. You know, Alfonso had talked about the 23rd Psalm. And I'm just reminded of one of my favorite parts of the 23rd Psalm. It says, he prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemy. There's something strong about knowing that God is still doing work even in the presence. In the presence. I'm not going to preach up here because that's not what I was sent to do. But again, we were super excited for that conversation. At this time, we will now